Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com.
Today we're going to look at the Crisis Pack 2 expansion for the DC Comics deck building game, much like the Crisis Pack 1 expansion, which you can also watch on my channel. I did a review of that some months ago. This adds a new way to play the game. The base game of the DC Comics deck building game, which is obviously a game that I like quite a lot, is competitive. Even though it doesn't make any thematic sense, you take control of these different superheroes or supervillains based on the Forever Evil set, and try to compete against each other to get as many points as possible with typical Ascension-style deck building. Crisis Mode makes all the players work together towards a common goal. The goals being getting through these Crisis cards and then getting through supervillains, just like in the base game, but these are impossible mode supervillains who are ridiculously tough. Some elements of this pack can be integrated back into the main base sets. There's new heroes that are specifically for the competitive mode, and the impossible villains could be used in the normal game as well. It just makes it more of a brutal and, I'll say, interesting game. But there are specific elements of this game, like the main deck cards and the Crisis superheroes, which are specifically made for the Crisis mode. Now, if you've already watched my review of the original Crisis Pack, there may not be a lot of surprises in my final thoughts, but we'll go ahead and just reiterate some of them anyways. And I will say that thematically speaking, for those who care about the comic book side of this game, this thematically has to do a lot with, first off, the Heroes United base set, which means that all of those superheroes and a lot of the villains there are represented again in their Crisis mode here, like Black Canary and Batgirl and Red Tornado. And also there's the focus is on the what's it called, Blackest Nights storyline of Green Lantern. That was actually a company-wide event with the Black Lanterns and heroes coming back to life, heroes and villains who had formerly been deceased, and so on. Let's go ahead and take a brief look at some of the stuff that comes in the new Crisis Pack 2. Then we're going to come back. I'll let you know what I think. Okay, I'm going to show you some of the new stuff that comes in the Crisis Pack 2 expansion for the DC Comics deck building game. I'm going to start with the superheroes, which are usable in any version of the game, not just the Crisis mode. So we have SAPPHIRE. When you play an equipment, reveal the top card of your deck. You may discard it or put it at the bottom of your deck. Then we have White Lantern Deadman, which would only make sense if you're really into the whole Lantern Corps storyline. Once during each of your turns, you may discard the cards with different colors, 2 cards with different colors from your hand. If you do, look at foe's hand, play a card from it, and then return that card to that player's hand. You have Saint Walker. The first time you play a hero during each of your turns, you can reveal the top card of your deck, and you may destroy it. Indigo 1, which is a very catchy name. The first time you play a red-colored card during your turn, draw a card. The first time you play a blue-colored card during your turn, +1 power. Red Lantern Supergirl. The first time any foe destroys a card during each player's turn, you can draw a card and then discard a card. Kyle Rayner, the Rainbow Coalition here. At the start of your turn, you may reveal 3 cards with different colors from your hand, and if you do, you can discard your hand and draw 5 cards. Now we get to the Crisis superheroes. These are really specifically made for Crisis mode. If you're not playing Crisis mode and you use them, they might either be just a little bit too weak or their power is just not as effective as it would be in Crisis mode. So these are all based off of the Heroes United superheroes. You have Starfire. When you buy or gain a superpower from the lineup, choose a player. That player may destroy a card in his hand. Oh, by the way, Starfire was a promo originally. That's not true. She wasn't in Heroes United. Black Canary. When you buy or gain a villain from the lineup, instead of destroying it, you put it on the bottom of your deck, which is actually really powerful in Crisis mode. Shazam. When you buy, gain, or defeat a card with 7 or greater, you may cost 7 or greater. You may put a card with cost 1 or greater from any player's discard pile on the bottom of the main deck. You have Batgirl. Once during each of your turns, you may discard a card. If you do, choose a number of different players up to the victory point value of the card discarded this way. That chosen player draws a card. Crisis Hawkman. If you play 2 or more heroes during your turn, choose a player. That player draws a card. So you see a lot of these, because it's Crisis, say choose a player. When another player is attacked, you may discard a defense card from your hands or in play. If you do, that player avoids the attack. Red Tornado Crisis mode. If you play 3 or more cards with different types during your turn, you may choose a player. That player puts his deck into his discard pile. And finally, Nightwing. If you play 2 or more equipment during your turn, each player may reveal the top card of his deck. Each who does may discard it. Let's take a look at the Crisis cards. All right, if you need a brief reminder as to how the crisis mode actually works, the goal of the game is still the same. The players are all now working cooperatively together to go through the entire deck of supervillain cards, except that these are the impossible supervillains. I'll get to those in a moment. But in order to take out the supervillains, you need to take out the crisis card. There's a whole stack of these that you have to use depending on the number of players. But in order to take out the crisis card, in addition to meeting its to beat condition, you also have to make sure there are no villains in the lineup. And instead of normally gaining villains, now you are destroying villains, unless you're the Crisis Black Canary. Now, how Rise of the Dead here works is that whenever you would normally destroy a card, you're now removing it from the game, and now destroyed cards are going to be randomly put back into the lineup. In order to beat it, you must destroy 5 cards with different colors from hand. Your team has to do this. You have 1 shot per player turn in crisis mode to beat a crisis, and players have to coordinate their actions without looking at each other's hands to say, okay, I'm making a to beat action. I hope everyone can actually successfully do this. I'm not going to look at all these, by the way, just want to show you some of the interesting ones. Demonic Summoning. Put all cards with cost 6 from the destroyed pile into the lineup at the start of your turn. Destroy a card in your hand. If you destroyed a card with cost 0, discard your hand. Your team must destroy 3 cards, each with cost 6, in your discard pile in order to beat it. Corrupted Companion is interesting because it's going to have you take a random unused supervillain and put it in front of a random player. You resolve its attack against each player, and at the start of that player's turn, it resolves its first appearance attack against each other player. In order to beat this crisis, you have to defeat that supervillain. 7 Deadly Sins Unleashed. You put 4 cards from the main deck into the lineup. When a superpower enters, put the top 4 cards. When a superpower enters the lineup, each player gains a weakness. To beat, your team must destroy 7 cards with different costs from their discard piles, which can be quite a feat. Shifting Loyalties. At the end of your turn, you place all cards you played this turn into the discard pile of the player on your left. To beat it, each player discards 7 cost worth of cards into the discard pile of the player on his left. And the last one I'll show you is Heroic Sacrifice. Now this one is easy because as soon as you play it, essentially, it just gets removed from the game, but its cost is very high. The player that defeated the previous supervillain removes this superhero from the game, their superhero from the game, destroys all cards with cost 1 or greater in his discard pile. That player gains a random unused superhero, and each other player gains 2 weakness cards. Then you remove this crisis from the game as if you had beaten it. So it's incredibly brutal. Let's go ahead and take a look at those impossible supervillains. Alright, so these are the impossible supervillains that you need to beat in order to win the game. You can use these in the base competitive version of the DC Comics deck building game, by the way. It's just that they're a bit harder to defeat, and they have much more brutal first appearance effects, but they're perfectly playable in both games. Hence, they actually have an ability that you can use in the competitive game, whereas in crisis mode, you don't put them into your deck, they just get automatically removed from the game. So Black Adam, when you play him, you get to reveal the top card of each deck in the game and take one of them immediately into your hand. His first appearance attack, when he comes out in either version of the game, each player destroys cards in his hands until he has only 1 card of each type, which can be really, really devastating. Black Lantern Superman here, you get to choose a foe and play every superpower in their discard pile if you play him. As a first appearance attack, each player gains 2 weakness cards. Each player with a superpower in his discard pile gains an additional weakness. Doomsday. I like this one because, well, his main ability is just +5 power and draw a card, which is good, but nothing that special. But his first appearance attack, each player destroys the top 2 cards of his deck, and even if you defend against it with a defense card, you have to destroy the card that you use to defend, which I think is just funny. And finally, we have Crisis Necron, and Necron, at least in the Crisis mode, is always going to be the last villain, the last supervillain that you have to defeat, and he has nothing but bad stuff for the Crisis mode. So what's going to happen is each player puts a random supervillain defeated this game in front of him and resolves its attack against himself. The stack ongoing ability, which means so long as he is still in play, each player must defeat his own supervillain. Necron cannot be defeated while a villain is in play or in the lineups, which makes him incredibly difficult. Alright, the last thing we're going to look at is some of the new main deck cards for the Crisis mode. Alright, I'm not going to show you all these, just the ones I think are interesting. You have a couple new locations. Mogo, ongoing defense. When any player is attacked, you may discard this 2 cards. If you do, that player avoids this attack. You have Atlantis. Once during each of your turns, you may put a card that you buy or gain from the lineup on top of any player's deck. That's kind of like Aquaman's Trident's ability from the base game. The villains in this pack are all Black Lantern versions of the superheroes. So you have Black Lantern, Wonder Woman, +2 power. Each foe with a hero in his discard pile gains a weakness. Each foe with a villain in his discard pile gains a weakness. You have Black Lantern, Green Arrow. Each foe destroys a starter in his hand. If a player cannot, he destroys the top card of his deck, which can be really annoying. And Black Lantern Batman, oh man, I'm never going to hear the end of it for making that mistake. Each foe gains a weakness. Each who has an equipment in his discard pile gains an additional weakness. And then the last one is Black Lantern Martian Manhunter. Each foe discards a random card. You may play any number of cards discarded this way and then return them to their owner's discard pile. So you see these are kind of like negative mirror images of the original superhero cards for those characters. Here's some superpowers. You have Channeling the Emotional Spectrum, which just does not sound menacing at all. While this card is in any zone, it is red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, or violet. So essentially all the colors. Possession, +3 power, but each foe reveals his hand and then resolves each attack in his hand against himself. And this card in particular is not an attack, although players could defend against the attacks they are being subjected to. Ganthet, really powerful hero. We'll go into the heroes now. You choose a player, and that player puts any number of cards with different colors and costs of 6 or less from her discard pile into his hand. His discard pile into his hand. I'm getting my pronouns mixed up. Indigo Tribe, +4 power, and villains you own and in the lineup become heroes this turn. They lose their other type. The Atom is a very strange, interesting card. You can destroy a card in your hand and then gain a card from the destroyed pile with cost equal to the destroyed card's cost and put it into your hand. So you can transmogrify cards from your hand into cards of the exact same cost. The Black Lantern Power Ring, you may gain a villain from the destroyed pile and put it into any player's discard pile. If you choose not to, you get +2 power. At the end of the game, it's worth 1 victory point for each power ring if you're in your deck, if you're using it for the competitive game. Otherwise, victory points don't really matter. The White Lantern Power Ring is the same as the Black Lantern Power Ring, but for heroes instead of villains. And finally, just because it's kind of amusing, I guess, in a macabre kind of way, the Skull of Batman. +3 power, gain all cards in the lineup with the same name as a card in the destroyed pile, which makes it very selectively useful. That's most of the new stuff that comes in the new Crisis Pack 2 for DC Comics deck building game. Let's get to my final thoughts. Like I said, even though I'm doing this review off the cuff, I imagine that I'm going to be repeating a lot of what I said in my original Crisis expansion, but let's do it anyways if people are coming to this fresh. I'll start off with the good stuff. The good stuff is that there are elements of the Crisis Pack 2 that can be taken and put back into the main competitive game of the DC Comics deck builder, and therefore also theoretically be used in the other Cerberus engine games, Naruto, Street Fighter. Those are the only other two I've played and care about, but I don't ever do that. I always just keep the DC stuff contained into itself, and you can easily mix the, well, it's really meant to be, the new heroes like White Lantern, Deadman, and Red Lantern, Supergirl, and Star Sapphire, what's his name, Saint something or other, the Blue Lantern. They can all be mixed back into the main game. And that is a really great part of this, because I think that some of those are really interesting and fascinating superheroes. I love Red Lantern Supergirl and her ability. It's really fun and useful to use. White Lantern Deadman's ability is a bit odd and clunky, but it's still very interesting and drastically different from a lot of the other superheroes and supervillain cards that I've seen up until this point. Star Sapphire, was it Saint Walker, Saint something or other? I can't remember his last name for some reason. The Blue Alien Lantern, all really cool powers, and I love having those. Now, the main deck Crisis cards are also really cool and interesting, but it's still unclear exactly whether or not you should be allowed to mix those back into the main game, because some of them have very powerful effects for a relatively low cost, like the 2 power rings, the Black Lantern ring and the White Power Ring, which, granted, are more useful in the Crisis mode, but can be very useful in the competitive mode as well. And some of these, it's just not clear whether or not some of them are underpowered or overpowered in the main game, and how you would even mix them in, since there's much less of them in both Crisis packs, as opposed to the amount of cards you get of each type in the base sets. But some of them are really cool, and I know that some people, not myself, will like make a whole big deck of all their DC Comics deck building game stuff. They'll construct it ahead of time, rather than what I do, which is just what the book suggests, of just taking superpowers from one set and villains from one set and heroes from one set and so on. So if you can do that, great. There's a lot of interesting cards here to be had. The impossible supervillains are also a great thing that I think from now on, I'm just going to take all the impossible supervillains from both Crisis packs with the villains from the Heroes United and the base game, and also even the Superheroes enemy cards from the Forever Evil set, mix them all up, and then make my villain deck out of that. Because yes, some of them are very, very powerful, and their first appearance attacks are super annoying, but they're also really interesting and really add an edge to the game that I can appreciate. It doesn't go too far off the edge into like being too frustrating, because it could happen to anyone, and I really, even if you can defend against it, it can sometimes be brutal, like Doomsday's ability, which means, yeah, you can defend against my attack, but then you destroy that defense card, which was really powerful. I mean, it can destroy your Blue Beetle card if you choose to use it for that. And I just think that it's a great way to play the game. The effects are really powerful. It can prolong the game because some of the impossible supervillains are much harder to take out, but I think it's something that's worth it. So all of that stuff that I just talked about is great in the Crisis Pack 2, and the cost of the game, depending on where you shop for it at, is between, I think, like 17 and 20 bucks, and that may or may not be worth it to you, but to me it is worth it because I do like the DC Comics deck building game, and all that stuff is great. Now, let's talk about the main point of this set, the Crisis Mode, which, much like with the original Crisis Pack, I think is awful and terrible. Nothing has changed about it in Crisis Pack 2. I forced myself and one of my groups to play it. I played it solo, I played it with other people just to say, okay, I'm going to give it a shot. Maybe the Crisis cards are a little bit better here. Maybe it just has a different feel over the Crisis Pack 1. Maybe they fixed some things and maybe it's better. I was absolutely wrong. It is just as terrible as it was before. The main issue is that it is too long. It lasts forever. It is like this grueling endurance test of a game that can go on, if you're lucky, it could go on for over 2 hours. Granted, some of the if you play with like 5 players with competitive mode, and some people aren't really familiar with it, the game can go up to 2 hours. But this is over 2 hours, usually over 3 hours of just grueling, trying to take out villains, like, oh, look, there's another villain, so now we can't do that. Okay, let's make an attempt to beat the Crisis. Can everyone do it? Let's try it. Oh, we failed again. Back to the drawing board. And some of those require you to destroy cards, which seriously sets you back. Yes, some of them are very interesting thematically. That's what I will give it. Like, for instance, the one that's Corrupted Companion, where someone just becomes like the supervillain because they put a supervillain in front of themselves. That's really interesting thematically. Or the one that, now, the one that I love and hate the most, I love it because it's thematic, is the one where one of the superheroes actually dies, the heroic sacrifice. And it's great because you don't have to spend the time to take out the Crisis. It just automatically gets resolved. But you are crushing one of the players. And in a game that can last from 2 to 3 or even more hours, you are essentially taking one player out of the game. Depending on when that Crisis happens, they are back to square one. And what if they have been milling their starter cards out the entire time? From what I remember about the card, there's nothing saying like, okay, restock back up to your starter cards. No, you could just be utterly demolished. And yes, there are special player abilities that can fill up, put other cards into players' decks, but that is just prolonging the game. That means that you're using actions that you should be using to take out the crises in order to help your now crippled friend. I don't mean to say that probably sounds offensive, but it's awful. There's just so many aspects of it that are just too long, too drawn out. It's not exciting. It's like taking the base game, it's incredibly similar to the base game, but just adding this extra stuff into it that just makes it into this long, protracted, just agonizing experience. I don't know why here's the thing. It's possible that because they haven't built the game from the ground up to have this mode incorporated, that it's just impossible for it to even be, for there to even be a good Crisis mode for the DC Comics deck building game, for there to be a good cooperative mode, I should say. If you want a cooperative superhero experience, you have to play Legendary. If you just don't care for Marvel Comics, you don't want to play Legendary, okay, but that is where the cooperative gameplay for superheroes is at this point. Yes, it's semi-cooperative, but even so, it is implemented so much better than it is in the DC Comics deck builder with its Crisis mode. I would never, ever willingly play the Crisis mode ever again. And yet, I enjoy the new competitive stuff that this expansion has to offer. So, is this going to be right for you? Well, that's really up to you. If you just want these new characters, if you want some of the new main deck cards, you think you can actually use it in a good way, or if you want the edge that the sort of vicious edge that the impossible villains add to your game, then yeah, it's going to be worth it to you. I mean, I wish it was less expensive for that amount of content, but it is worth it for that. But if you're coming here like, yes, finally I can make my DC Comics deck building game cooperative, I would urge you to have caution, because to me, it's terrible. I'll never play that way again. Your mileage might vary, but I would definitely try before I buy if that's the case, especially if you're coming to DC Comics deck building completely new and are like, well, I haven't wanted to play it because it's not cooperative, but if I buy the base set and this, then it's cooperative. It's a huge red flag. Don't do it. Try it first. That is the Crisis Pack 2 for DC Comics deck building game.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.